Meet the B-25, the Billy Mitchell. She's built for low-level, torpedo, and long-range level bombing. From now on, she's your ship. You'll want to know her like the back of your hand. So grab a chute pack and we'll try her out. A good pilot begins every flight with a thorough visual inspection. We'll do the same. Make sure your nose gear locking pin is engaged, with cap on. Otherwise, a shimmy will develop when you taxi. Check your shock struts for pressure and your tires for proper inflation, according to your load. Are your wheel chocks in place? The control surfaces, the body of the airplane, the nacelles, and the wing. Examine them all for evidence of gasoline or oil leakage. Never enter your plane without checking the front fuel cell, rear fuel cell, and auxiliary fuel cell on each wing. Make sure you have at least 21 gallons of oil in each oil reservoir. Replace the gasoline filler cap with care, making sure the handle folds to the rear to prevent slipstream from working the cap loose during flight. All these and many other items should have been checked for you, but play safe. Look for trouble yourself. As you enter the hatch, check the air bottle for your emergency brakes. It must be charged to between 550 and 600 pounds pressure. See that all 3 escape hatches are unlocked, so that in an emergency someone can get to you from outside. Always fasten your safety belt before you leave the line. Unlock the flying controls and adjust the pilot's seat for comfort. Make sure the locking lever is secured in the down position. Put on your throat microphone and headset. Check the ignition switches off and set your parking brakes. If your plane has been inactive for more than 15 minutes, have your props pulled through 10 or 12 blades before you start the engines. This is highly important. Oil may have drained into the lower cylinders. Next, connect the external battery supply if one is available, so you won't run down the airplane's batteries. Now start a methodical tour of your instruments. First, turn on the fuel emergency shutoff valves, then the generator and active inverter switches. Open cowl flaps, close oil shutters, move mixture control into full rich position. Open your throttles 1/2 inch to give about 1,000 RPM, and lock the automatic pilot off. Turn on battery disconnect switches. Next, switch on your ignition and fuel booster pumps. A good pilot always starts his right engine first. Energize the starter, then prime 5 to 7 shots at 1 second each if the engine is cold, or 1 to 3 shots if the engine is hot. Now, after you've warned the ground crew and made sure someone is standing by with a fire extinguisher, mesh the starter until the engine starts. However, don't hold the starter engaged for long periods. You'll burn out your booster coils. Oil pressure should rise to 40 pounds within 30 seconds after the engine takes hold. If it doesn't, cut the engine and investigate. If it does, start your left engine the same way you did your right. There's an alternate method of starting, which many pilots prefer. You can engage the starter and prime as necessary while the engine is turning over. Idle and warm up your engines at 1,000 to 1,200 RPM. They are not warmed up to a safe point for takeoff until cylinder head temperature registers 150 degrees and oil temperature 40 degrees, at which time the oil cooler shutters may be opened. Next, both pilot and co-pilot go through the checklist, item by item. Nose gear locking pin, checked, okay. Automatic pilot, locked off. Now check your flying controls for free and proper movement, and make sure the controls respond. The co-pilot looks out to watch the movement of rudders, elevators, and ailerons. The checklist continues. De-icer control, off. Pilot hatch, closed and locked. Lower turret, retracted. All hatches closed. It's time now to check your fuel levels. Suction, 3.75 to 4.25. General hydraulic pressure, 800 to 1,100 pounds. Brake pressure, 1,000 to 1,200 pounds. Fuel booster pumps, both on. Fuel pressure, 6 to 7 pounds. Now you're ready to trim your tabs. Trim elevators from 0 to 1/4 degree tail heavy, depending on the center of gravity position. Ailerons 0 and rudder 0. Propeller, full increase RPM. Check mixture at full rich position and lock snug. Lock your supercharger in low. Open the oil cooler shutters. Carburetor air, normal, unless icing conditions prevail. Wing flaps come down 15 degrees for normal takeoff. Control neutral. Cowl flaps open. Controls neutral. Emergency brake control, safety. Emergency hydraulic selector valve, normal. Fuel emergency shutoff valves, on. Set your cockpit and compartment heaters off. They're the combustible type, unsafe to use during takeoff. See that your static pressure selector handle is set at normal and your gyro instruments uncaged. While you're on the ground, never release the landing gear safety lock or throw the safety latch. If you do, then the landing gear lever might accidentally be lifted and a B-25 is not designed for digging tunnels. Someone's carelessness in securing the safety lock and latch in the plane made this ridiculous accident possible. Propellers cost money. You can't throw them away like matches. Another word of caution. Before running up your engines on the line, always look behind you to make sure that your prop blast won't endanger persons or property. Your next step is to check the propeller controls at about 2,100 RPM. Move controls to full decrease and note decrease in RPM. Then shift controls to full increase, and RPM should return to original setting. Check magnetos at 25 inches of manifold pressure and 1,800 to 2,000 RPM. A drop of 75 RPM on one magneto is nothing to worry about. If there's a greater drop, or if undue engine vibration develops, investigate at once. If your magnetos check okay, you're about ready to go. Now a final check of cylinder head temperature, oil temperature, and oil pressure, and you're ready to contact the control tower for permission to taxi. When you get it, have your chocks removed, release your parking brakes, and you're on your way. You don't try to turn before your ship gets moving. To do so would put dangerous side stress on the nose wheel. You remember to use your brakes cautiously until you're familiar with their action. Brake pedal forces are light. They don't build up in proportion to pedal travel. So you steer with the throttles as much as you can, saving your brakes from excessive heat and wear. An engine speed of 1,000 to 1,200 RPM is ample for taxiing. Practice will give you smoothness on turns, but never try to pivot on one wheel. The minimum radius of turn for the inside wheel should be at least 10 feet. Before you roll onto the runway, run your engines up to takeoff power once more, and again hold them there a second to see if you've really got full power available. Now contact the control tower for permission to take off. Adjust the throttle locks carefully so your throttles won't creep. Don't forget to steer with those throttles for the early part of your run, till you have speed enough to give rudder control. And remember the relation of gross weight to flying speed. If you're carrying a light to moderate load, the pull-off can be made at an indicated airspeed of 100 to 105 miles per hour. But if you have a medium-heavy or heavy load, your pull-off speed should be between 115 and 120 miles per hour. So much for normal flight. But let's see what the B-25 will do under simulated emergency conditions. For example, here we have an obstacle clearance takeoff from a short field. On a takeoff of this kind, you first taxi to the end of the runway as far as possible and lower your flaps to 30 degrees. Your indicated airspeed varies from 95 miles per hour with a very light weight of 23,000 pounds up to 120 miles per hour with a heavy gross weight of 36,000 pounds. Corresponding speeds for the climb are 106 miles per hour for the lightweight and 136 miles per hour for the heavyweight. Hold the plane with your brakes and open the throttles to takeoff power. When you're sure you have it, release your brakes quickly and you shoot away like a rocket. You're loaded right now to about 26,000 pounds gross weight, so keep an eye on that speed indicator, and when it reaches 102 miles per hour, pull firmly back on the stick and climb your plane at about 115 miles per hour. Remember, this is not the airspeed for the best rate of climb. It's correct for the best angle of climb over an obstacle. When your plane is safely airborne, but only after a definite signal from the pilot, the co-pilot retracts the landing gear. Your cowl flaps may be closed, if cylinder head temperatures can be held within normal range. Before beginning to climb, it's smart to keep your nose down until a safe single-engine flying speed of about 140 miles per hour is reached. Meanwhile, the pilot reduces manifold pressure to 38 inches, and the co-pilot reduces RPM to 2,400. As you rise above 800 feet, retract your wing flaps. Bring them up gradually. That way you won't settle or lose altitude. Then return flap controls to neutral. While you're climbing, the co-pilot checks all engine instruments to see that indications are normal. If your mission is one requiring endurance, you have a choice of 3 cruising conditions. Maximum cruise, using 29.5 to 31.5 inches of manifold pressure at 2,100 RPM, in low blower and full rich up to 13,000 feet. Desired cruise, using 27 inches of manifold pressure at 2,000 RPM in low blower and full rich up to 16,000 feet. Or long-range cruise, using 26.5 to 27.5 inches of manifold pressure at 1,550 RPM in low blower and cruising lean up to 13,000 feet. However, if speed is essential at higher altitudes than 11,000 feet, you'll have to shift into high blower. Before this shift is made, the pilot retards the throttles to 25 inches of manifold pressure, and the co-pilot reduces RPM to 1,700. Shift blower controls quickly to save unnecessary wear on the clutches. With high ratio blower in operation, you can pull up to 39 inches of manifold pressure at an engine speed of 2,400 RPM, with mixture control in full rich. On long flights, you can avoid unnecessary fatigue by using the automatic pilot. Trim your plane carefully to hold a straight and level course with hands off. Follow usual procedure in uncaging and adjusting the directional gyro, bank and climb gyro, and trim knobs. Then slowly move the automatic pilot to on position. You can feel it taking hold. Now readjust as needed to hold the ship on course. So we're at a safe altitude, we might as well investigate the stalling characteristics of the B-25. At normal gross weight, the clean wing and gear retracted, the Mitchell stalls at about 101 miles per hour indicated. But with wheels and flaps down, as seen here, she stalls at close to 80 miles per hour. You develop a slight buffeting, and there she goes. To recover from the stall, depress your nose and increase power until you gain normal flying speed once more. Naturally, a plane with a heavy load like this one will lose several hundred feet of altitude before she recovers. When it comes to dive bombing, you can count on your Mitchell to the last notch. With a gross weight of 30,000 pounds or less, Your maximum permissible diving speed will be 340 miles per hour indicated. Don't exceed this for any loading, and keep your eyes open when you try diving in rough air. The B-25 pulls out nicely, but keep your control forces at a minimum so you can make a smooth, easy recovery without putting too much stress on the ship. If an engine cuts out on you, don't forget your minimum speed for control. Using only one engine at rated power, it's 140 miles per hour indicated. At less, if you apply full power to the good engine, the ship will begin to yaw. Instead, put the nose down to maintain required flying speed, and it's your rudder trim tab to balance the loss of engine thrust. The tab has ample power for this purpose. Meanwhile, feather the prop on the dead engine to prevent windmilling, and be sure to close cowl flaps so cooling is gradual. Fly with your dead engine high, and don't try any violent maneuvers. Keep a weather eye on the cylinder head temperature of your good engine, and if you need to, adjust the cowl flaps to keep within maximum permissible limits. Don't be afraid to tackle a single-engine landing if it's necessary. Just keep cool and use your head. It's smart to make a high approach, reducing power all the way, rather than to start an approach from a distance and drag in over the treetops. Don't fail to go through that checklist with great care now. When your airspeed has fallen below 170 miles per hour, indicated, on approach, put down your landing gear. Hold your airspeed above 140 miles per hour. Govern your good engine at 2400 RPM constant, so if you can't land this time, you'll be sure to have power enough to go around. Remember that all planes lose efficiency under landing conditions. This is especially true if you're flying on one engine. Don't use full flaps until you're positive you can land this time. As you make your final approach, keep retrimming so you won't have to worry about a lot of changes at the last minute. If you keep your speed above 140 miles per hour, you can always pull up your landing gear and go around. When you know the landing's in the bag, throttles, brake your glide, and set her down. All right, now let's cover a normal landing, which also takes its share of intelligence and skill. You follow your landing checklist, item by item. Automatic pilot, off. De-icer control, off. Lower gun turret and radio trailing antenna, retracted. Fuel levels for both engines, checked. General hydraulic pressure, 800 to 1100 pounds. Brake pressure, 1000 to 1200 pounds. Fuel booster pumps, on. Prop, steady at 2100 RPM. Mixture, full rich. Supercharger, locked in low. Oil cooler shutters open, cowl flaps closed, and controls neutral. Landing gear extended, but not until airspeed drops below 170. Now check your landing gear indicator and warning horn, and fasten landing gear safety latch. Make your approach at about 130 miles per hour, with full flaps. Hold her dead on 130 till you reach your flare-off point, then make ground contact close to 100 miles per hour indicated. Land with the tail quite low, and hold your nose wheel off the runway until you slow down. It isn't built to take heavy loads at high speed. Besides, with the tail low, your plane slows more rapidly, and so you shorten your landing run. Be easy with those brakes till you know their action. After landing, move your props to full increase. Turn your fuel booster pumps off. Your cowl flaps open. Wing flaps up. Controls neutral. Gyro instruments caged. As you return to the line, taxi at 1000 to 1200 RPM. And on turns, let your inside wheel follow a 10-foot radius. Always park with your nose wheel straight and follow prescribed routine for stopping your engine. Idle the engines at 1000 RPM until cylinder head temperatures drop below 190 degrees. Then run them at 1500 to 1600 RPM for 5 seconds. And move mixture control to idle cutoff. At the same time, open your throttles. After the engines stop, lock your flying controls, replace locks on hydraulic controls, and turn all switches off. So there's your Mitchell. Intelligent, disciplined pilot technique will make these babies do everything but talk. Speed, endurance, responsiveness, everything it takes for long, hard missions, and plenty of protective armament besides. Yep, there she goes. Treat her right, gentlemen, and you'll see why the experts call her the best medium bomber in the world.
Named for Brigantine General William "Billy" Mitchell, the charismatic air power prophet who proved in 1921 and 1923 that planes could sink battleships. The B-25 Mitchell gained an unsurpassed reputation as a ground attack bomber and ship killer. The rugged, versatile B-25 saw action on almost every Allied front, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, and from Burma to Normandy, and was also regarded by many as the most successful twin-engine combat aircraft of World War II. Little more than 4 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt held an urgent meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to discuss American military response to their enemy in the Pacific. The president, visibly preoccupied about American morale after the treacherous Japanese carrier airstrike, told his senior officers that mainland Japan had to be bombed as soon as possible. This, he thought, would boost the country's morale, increase voluntary enlistments, and fortify war bonds. The results of his order was the Doolittle Raid, offensive against Japan with one of the bloodiest and best-remembered bomber raids of World War II. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle and laden with extra fuel, 500-pound bombs, and incendiary clusters. 16 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers lumbered 500 feet along the wooden flight deck of the 19,900-ton Yorktown-class aircraft carrier USS Hornet CV-8 early on Saturday, April 18, 1942, and took off into a stiff wind. They climbed into a rainy, murky sky and flew 800 miles eastward to hit military targets in the Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama areas. It was the first and only time that bombers had been launched from a carrier, and they achieved complete surprise when they reached their objectives. The material damage they inflicted was slight, but the raid had a major psychological impact. James H. Doolittle, in his autobiography, later wrote, "An attack on the Japanese homeland would cause confusion in the minds of the Japanese people and sow doubt about the reliability of their leaders. Americans badly needed a morale boost." The stunned Japanese were forced to push forward their planned attack on Midway Atoll, preventing further carrier attacks against their country, while the Americans received a much-needed morale lift after a series of defeats in the Far East. The gallant Doolittle was awarded the Medal of Honor, and his historic raid, the country's first victory of the war, gained instant fame for the North American B-25 Mitchell, one of the most widely used and effective twin-engine bombers of the war. Meanwhile, the chunky, affable Doolittle, a record-breaking peacetime air racer, became a national hero and went on to command successively in the U.S. 12th and 15th Air Forces, the Northwest African Strategic Air Force, and the 8th Air Force. The mission and the B-25 Doolittle's performance became so famous that it easily overshadowed the B-25's next combat role. Equipped with a powerful 75mm M4 tank gun, a dozen high-caliber machine guns, rockets, and a 3,000-pound bomb load capacity, the B-25 Model G was a heavy-hitting gunship to be reckoned with. For the first half-decade or so of its existence, NAA had not ventured into the design of aircraft larger than those powered by a single engine, and had generally restricted its activities to building trainers. Metal was cut on something more ambitious in 1937, when the NA-21 Dragon took shape. With the Army Air Corps' designation XB-21, this twin-engine bomber was fitted with superchargers for high-altitude flight. It featured power-operated turret armament, a tailwheel landing gear, and a single fin and rudder configuration. Although it was a well-proportioned design with a superficial resemblance to the slightly smaller Douglas B-18, The XB-21 did not possess a particularly outstanding performance and was not ordered into production. At the time that the XB-21 appeared, there was much deliberation as to the merits of 4 engines as opposed to a twin-engine bomber. Funding could not then stretch to great numbers of both, but there was a clear need for the smaller attack aircraft and/or a medium bomber. Having learned much from the XB-21 exercise, NAA turned its attention to a second bomber design. This would appear later in 1937 as the NA-40. It was another twin intended to meet the requirements for aircraft in the only vaguely definition medium class. It had a tricycle undercarriage and raised tandem cockpit. It provided bomb stowage in the fuselage, and it offered a good rather than outstanding performance. The NA-40 was impressive enough as an engineering exercise, and it had promising development potential. While it was true enough that Hitler's Luftwaffe was flaunted as a superior weapon in a world still very much locked into the trench warfare mentality of World War I and into the belief in Maginot Line-type fixed fortifications, the propaganda emanating from Berlin was not backed by much substance. In terms of 100% government backing for her industry, a seemingly sound organization, and a particular experience through a successful deployment in Spain as the Condor Legion, the Luftwaffe appeared to possess a real edge over her European and indeed American rivals, and the bold words of carefully manipulated facts, both broadcast and written, worked wonderfully well for the Third Reich, buying it valuable time. Unfortunately, few independent individuals were in a position to check the facts and figures. Had the true picture been known, it would have been obvious that the German bombers of the late 1930s, all of them in the medium class, were in many respects technically inferior to those on the drawing boards in Britain and the US. Only later the Junkers 88 could be considered of real quality. Hap Arnold sent Charles Lindbergh on a comprehensive fact-finding tour of Germany, and the famous Atlantic solo flyer did his best to be objective. Given a warm welcome by the Nazi hierarchy, he reported back as best he could. In Lindbergh's opinion, the Germans did appear to have a substantial lead, particularly in dive bombing, which the US, and to far lesser extent Britain and France, had pursued. The US Navy particularly favored the dive bomber as a means to attack shipping targets accurately, and had brought the SBD Dauntless into service before the war. In Japan, even better dive bombers were being developed for the Imperial Navy, though evidently it was even harder for Western nations to substantiate the quantity of such machines. The US Army, having included single-engine dive bombers in its inventory for some years, gradually moved towards larger machines with 2 or even 4 engines, able to deliver bombs in conventional straight and level flight over considerable ranges. In terms of deploying dive bombers from land bases, the US Army was largely unable, try as it might, to broaden out the undoubtedly successful use of such by the Navy and the Marine Corps. Incidentally, it was the NAA that was later give the US Army its one and only, and last, successful wartime dive bomber in the shape of the A-36 Invader, the career of which was curtailed only by a limited production run. With war in Europe an increasingly real possibility, Franklin Roosevelt moved to expand the U.S. Armed Forces to unprecedented size. The president was extremely worried at the inflated figures he was being given on the strength of the Luftwaffe, as was Hap Arnold, who apparently believed them implicitly. On the 28th of September 1933, FDR proposed an expansion plan which was honed by Arnold and presented to Congress in January 1939. That April, the Air Corps was authorized to expand from the then current level of 2,300 aircraft to 5,500 aircraft in 24 groups by June 1941. During the remaining months of peace in Europe, NAA, then under the guiding hand of President James Dutch Kindleberger, completed and began taxiing tests on the NA-40 in preparation for the first flight. This historic event occurred on the 29th of January 1939, with company pilot Paul B. Balfour and engineer Frank H. Lyons at the controls. Unfortunately, they soon experienced problems, in that the aircraft developed severe tail buffeting, which got worse as the speed increased, and fluctuating oil and cylinder head temperatures could not be stabilized by various cowl flap settings. However, they managed to land without mishap. In addition, the slow feathering of the Curtiss propellers meant that the single-engine flight was out of the question. These troubles meant that the speed of the NA-40 was increased only gradually over a period of time. In 14 flights, a total time of 5 hours and 20 minutes in the air, The top recorded speed was 265 miles an hour. By the 1st of March 1939, the NA-40's engines had been changed. Wright GR2600A71-3 engines were fitted, these providing 1,600 horsepower each for takeoff, and in this form, the aircraft was redesignated the NA-40B. By 1939, Air Corps' procurement of new aircraft followed an established pattern. When a requirement had been determined, a set of specifications was issued. These included performance requirements and also the date and time when the physical article had to be at right field for the bid opening in competition with other entries. Thus, in response to Proposal 38-385, NAA put forward the NA-40, Martin submitted the Model 167, and Douglas the DB-7B. Both Stearman's Model X100 and Bell's Model 9 were withdrawn early on, and the DB-7B was destroyed in a crash on the 23rd of January 1939. While the loss of the NA-40 was an undoubted setback to the NAA, Dutch Kindelberger appeared unruffled and merely thankful that the test crew had survived the crash. The amount of data that the aircraft had previously accumulated was adequate proof to the Air Corps that the basic design was sound, and it was estimated that building a similar aircraft was well within the company's engineering and production capability. However, there was no Air Corps production contract for the NA-40, and, in fact, no manufacturer was judged to have won the attack bomber competition. As the North American and Douglas designs had crashed, and the Bell and Stearman submissions were rejected, Martin's 167 was the natural winner, but the Air Corps refused it a production contract. Having studied reports on the medium bombers then in service in Europe, the USAAC urged manufacturers to build better. For example, it was strongly believed that the new U.S. light bombers should be capable of higher speeds, up to 300 to 345 miles an hour. This important requirement was reflected in the Air Corps Proposal No. 39-640, a new medium bomber. Issued on the 11th of March 1939, it stated that the winning aircraft should be able to carry a bomb load of 3,000 pounds over a range of 2,000 miles at top speed of more than 300 miles an hour. Its deployment was to include operating at altitudes between 8,000 and 14,000 feet, undertaking the preliminary role of supporting ground forces, and attacking a range of tactical targets. In response, the NAA prepared the NA-62, with Douglas submitting the B-23 and Martin the Model 179, which became the B-26 Marauder. The AAC wanted an initial 385 examples of the winning design delivered within 2 years. The winner of the Proposal 39-640 was the B-26 with 813.6 quality points. The NA-62 scored 673.6 for second place, and the B-23 was third with 610.3. But limited for capacity, the entire contract might have gone to the Marauder. But Martin could only guarantee to deliver 201 aircraft to the Army order in the time allowed. The NAA consequently picked up a contract for the balance to 385, namely 184 B-25s. Within the initial NA-62 contract confirmed, NAA built 1-9 scale B-25s for testing in the wind tunnel at the California Institute of Technology. These tests confirmed the soundness of the design, and work proceeded on a full-scale mock-up for official scrutiny. The building and assembly of the first B-25 40-2165 was all but completed by the summer of 1940, when the first ground and taxiing tests took place. During production, North American Aviation incorporated various modifications to the airplane. The first one was flattening the outer wing panels to produce a slight angle outboard the engine nacelles to prevent stability problems. The result was the peculiar gull-wing configuration that would make the B-25 easily recognizable. Other tweaks included the size increase of the tail fins, including various .30 caliber MGs, additional armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks. When interviewed by author Stephen Wilkinson, veteran pilot Jim Harley said that the B-25 was rock stable, painfully easy on takeoff, and one of the most stable platforms in the landing configuration of any airplane I've ever flown, other than maybe the Mustang. Single-engine control speed was probably the biggest thing to be concerned about. It was around 145 miles an hour, and you lifted off at 90 to 100. Get it off the ground, get the gear coming up, level the airplane over the runway, and let it accelerate to 145. Then you can go right into the climb. It takes 20 to 30 seconds. It accelerates really fast. The B-25B variant used for the Doolittle Raid over Tokyo in 1942 was equipped with a nose-mounted 30 caliber machine gun, 2 turrets powered with twin 50 cal MGs, and a full 3,000-pound bomb load capacity. Although the raid was a success, it proved that the B-25B still needed some modifications for long-range missions in low-level combat. Some of the aircraft crashed or got stranded in China and Russia because they ran out of fuel. Having completed 119 B-25Bs, the NAA incorporated further changes and improvements to produce the B-25C. Externally similar to its immediate predecessor, this became the first true combat model of the Mitchell to be mass-produced. It was built in 7 subtypes. Several contracts covered the production of 1,625 B-25Cs, all of which were completed at Inglewood. Although externally similar to the B-25B, the new model Mitchell had numerous changes under the skin. Power was provided by Wright R2600-13 engines with Holley carburetors that replaced the Bendix-Stromberg type. Despite its uprated engines, the B-25C could not quite equal the 300 miles an hour top speed of the Model B, managing only 284 miles at 15,000 feet. The service ceiling was also lower than before at 23,500 feet. An extra 200 miles range was nevertheless achieved by fitting 6 auxiliary wing cells, 3 on each side, holding a total of 152 gallons per side. In addition, provision was made for 2 jerry tanks to fit in the waist compartment, these holding 62.5 gallons each. With the fixed bomb bay tank, plus a droppable bay tank holding a total of 550 gallons, the B-25C could also be fitted with a ferry tank. The standard armament chosen for the B-25B in medium bomber configuration remained the same as earlier models until on the B-25C-5 batch, a 0.5-inch machine gun was introduced to replace the 0.3-inch weapon at the nose position. At the same time, a single fixed 0.5-inch machine gun was installed on the lower starboard side of the nose for operation from the cockpit, and this was fully controllable by the pilot. This became the first hint of the strafing role that the B-25 would help develop for the rest of the Pacific theater. Additionally, engineers added the external bomb racks under each wing to increase firepower. The bomb bay could now carry a 2,000-pound torpedo for taking down enemy vessels. The B-25C version was shipped to Great Britain, Russia, China, and Canada. The British RAF and the Canadian Air Force used B-25Cs to attack supply lines and oil depots controlled by the Wehrmacht in East Flanders and the other secondary objectives scattered in the French-German border. The Dutch also received the same B-25C variant and participated in the East Indies campaigns, raining fire upon the Japanese advance through Asia's jungles. The USSR used different variants employed by the Soviet Air Force from the early days of the siege of Stalingrad up to the end of the war. In the European theater, all countries used it as just another strategic bomber, but in the Pacific, it was shown as a fast and brutal strafing bomber. Although the B-25 was designed to bomb from median altitudes and level flight, it was frequently used in the Southwest Pacific theater in treetop level strafing and missions with parachute-retarded fragmentation bombs against Japanese airfields in New Guinea and the Philippines. These commerce destroyers were also used on strafing and skip bombing missions against Japanese shipping trying to resupply their armies. The USAAF played a significant role in pushing the Japanese back to their home islands. The type operated with great effect in the Central Pacific, Alaska, North Africa, Mediterranean, and China-Burma-India theaters. In Burma, the B-25 was used to attack Japanese communications links, especially bridges in central Burma. It also helped supply the besieged troops in Imphal in 1944. The China Air Task Force, the Chinese-American Composite Wing, the 1st Air Command Group, the 341st Bomb Group, and eventually the relocated 12th Bomb Group all operated the B-25 in the China-Burma-India theater. Many of these missions involved battlefield isolation, interdiction, and close air support. Later in the war, as the USAAF acquired bases in other parts of the Pacific, the Mitchell could strike targets in Indochina, Formosa, and Kyushu, increasing the usefulness of the B-25. It was also used in some of the shortest raids of the Pacific War, striking from Saipan against Guam and Tinian. The 41st Bomb Group had used it against Japanese-occupied islands that had been bypassed by the main campaign, such as the Marshall Islands. The USAAF Anti-Submarine Command made a great use of the B-25 in 1942 and 1943. Some of the earliest B-25 bomb groups also flew the Mitchell on coastal patrols after the Pearl Harbor attack, prior to the AAFAC organization. Many of the 24 or so anti-submarine squadrons flew the B-25C, D, and G series in the American Theater anti-submarine campaign, often in the distinctive White Sea search camouflage. In October 1942, under a U.S. requirement for the ground attack and strafing platform, North American came up with the B-25G, the first American gunship. Author Brian J. Smith, in his work, The Dynamics of B-25 Innovation, wrote that the North American company made history when they mounted the largest forward-firing cannon ever used in a U.S. bomber. This was a 75 M4 cannon, basically a tank gun with 18-pound projectiles. But that was not all. Months later, in 1943, the ultimate pack-a-punch aircraft entered production. The B-25H and B-25J were equipped with up to 14 50 caliber machine guns. This moving castle was impregnable. It could not be flanked from any side. North, south, east, and west were entirely covered by machine guns that rained hell everywhere they went. Pilots began to call the B-25 gunship the commerce destroyers. The manufacturer was undoubtedly interested in improving the plane. However, General George Kenney of the Army Air Forces and Captain Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn had also a significant influence in the modifications done to the bomber throughout the war. General Douglas MacArthur once said of Kenney, "Of all the commanders of our major air forces engaged in World War II, none surpassed General Kenney in those three great essentials of successful combat leadership: aggressive vision, mastery over air strategy and tactics, and the ability to exact the maximum in fighting qualities from both men and equipment." Both Kenney and Captain Pappy Gunn insisted on customizing the B-25s with up to 18 MGs. They also pushed forward the role of skip bombing for the aircraft, which became crucial for the Pacific. Stephen Wilkinson best described the role. Often, skip bombing meant literally throwing a bomb against a hull, and the B-25 speed made it particularly effective at this. Skip bombing had first been tried with B-17s, but they weren't fast enough to get the job done. Strafing Japanese airfields was the main objective of the B-25s in the Pacific. With more than a dozen MGs and a powerful tank cannon, the aircraft could deal heavy damage in one run when above an enemy airfield. Destroying Japanese airplanes on the ground proved so tremendously effective that for a brief time, Allied forces tried doing the same in Europe with experimental jet ammunition. This motivated German pilots to wreak havoc on the ground. When the war ended, the B-25 served in the air forces of over 15 countries. The U.S. Navy, Marines, and the future USAF experimented with other configurations, but those never saw combat in great numbers as in World War II. The B-25 was a safe and forgiving aircraft to fly. With one engine out, 60-degree banking turns into the dead engine were possible, and control could be easily maintained down to 145 miles an hour. The pilot had to remember to maintain engine-out directional control at low speeds after takeoff with rudder. If this maneuver were attempted with ailerons, the aircraft could snap out of control. The tricycle landing gear made for excellent visibility while taxiing. As a result, many pilots eventually suffered from some degree of hearing loss. The high noise level was due to design and space restrictions in the engine cowlings, which resulted in the exhaust stacks protruding directly from the cowling ring and partly covered by a small triangular fairing. This arrangement directed exhaust and noise directly at the pilot and crew compartments. The Mitchell was exceptionally sturdy and could withstand tremendous punishment. In 1947, legislation created an independent United States Air Force, and by that time, the B-25 inventory numbered only a few hundred. Some B-25s continued in service into the 1950s in training, reconnaissance, and support roles. The principal use during this period was undergraduate training of multi-engine aircraft pilots slated for reciprocating engine or turboprop cargo, aerial refueling, or reconnaissance aircraft. Henry H. Arnold and Dwight D. Eisenhower both used converted B-25Js as their personal transports. The last VB-25J in active service was retired in May 1960 at the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The B-25 Mitchell gunship became the foundational rock of the legendary Lockheed AC-130 of the USAF that would first see action during the Vietnam War.
When I got to the 345th, I was assigned to the 500th Bomb Squadron. There were 4 squadrons, the 500th being one of them. And I was told it was called the Bloody 500. And the reason why it was because it had the highest loss rate. But also it had the highest combat record. One goes hand in hand with the other one. They called it the Bloody 500, but when you compared all 4 squadrons and their combat record, the 500th was heads and shoulders above the rest of them. And obviously you're going to have the highest loss rate as well. But it was interesting that when I first joined them, nobody got too buddy-buddy with me until I'd flown 4 or 5 missions. It was almost like saying, prove to me you're going to be around a while, and then we'll get to know you better. And I found that to be true. Even though I was a combat crew commander and had my own crew, it was standard procedure to fly upwards to about 5 missions as a co-pilot with some of the older pilots. So you got a feel for how the organization operated. I flew 3 missions and they turned me loose. And I remember my operations officer, who was about 6 inches shorter than I was, looking up at me and said, "I'm turning you loose, but I got one final word I want to give you." He said, "If I catch your rear end above 50 feet off the deck over the target, I'll ground you." What he was trying to emphasize was that the lower we flew, the better chance we had of getting home, and he was absolutely right. And it was many a target we flew over 10 and 20 feet. None of the training we received in the combat crew training back in the States was applicable. It was all medium altitude, and it was what the B-25 was originally turned out to do. And it wasn't until I got to the Pacific and they did the retrofit in field to make strafers out of them that we experienced that kind of flying with the B-25. A gentleman who is known as Paul Pappy Gunn. You need to know a little bit about Pappy to understand why it became a strafer. Pappy Gunn had spent 20 years in the Navy as an enlisted pilot. And when he retired out of the Navy, he bought 2 twin-engine civilian airplanes and took them to Manila and started the Philippine Airlines with those 2 airplanes. When the Japanese came, his primary role was to fly out VIPs and get very important people out of the Philippines. He finally got down to a point where he was flying one airplane and cannibalizing the other one to keep that one airborne. He had a wife and 3 children there, and on one of his last trips was to take them out, and he found out that they had been arrested by the Japanese and were in prison camp in Manila. So he wasn't able to get his own family out. They spent the war in prisoner of war camp. The Army Air Corps understood how much he had already done in flying important people out. Nobody knew the Philippines better than he did. He was also aware of all the little runway strips that were out in the jungle that the Japanese didn't know because he'd been operating from them. They offered him a direct commission to captain, which he accepted, and he was in his early 40s. And he accepted that, and General George Kenny, who was the Air Force chief of MacArthur's staff, brought him to Australia as his sort of troubleshooter and turned him loose on things that would make the war go faster. And one of the things he did was he felt that the medium altitude bombardment was not going to work in the jungles of the Pacific. Even the B-17s and the B-24s were flying at much lower level than they were would normally do. So he took the nose off of a B-25, and he first put 450 calibers in it, went out and did a little testing with it, and eventually he ended up with 8 50s in the nose. He had to do some changes in configuration of the aircraft so the center of gravity would be correct. He did 20 missions, went out and flew 20 missions by himself with great results, tremendous results. And General Kenny then asked the factory, went through engineering, to not send any B-25s out that weren't configured as an 850s in the nose type of bird, strafer. And the word he got back was the engineer said the airplane couldn't get off the ground. And it wasn't until he took a gun by the hand and flew back to the States and threw a bunch of mission pictures on the table, said, "Tell me it won't get off the ground. This is what it's been able to do." And General Arnold threw the engineers out of his office and said, "Go back and build the airplane." And we started receiving them from the States then in that configuration. But all the ones that we were flying up until that time, until early 1945, were merely airplanes that we flew back to Australia, and they were done in the field. Normal B-25 would have 6 members, and the extra one would be a bombardier as well as a navigator. And when you stopped using it as a medium altitude bomber and went to strafers, you don't have a bombardier because the pilot did all his own bombing and firing of the forward guns. And the navigator strictly navigated. And then you had co-pilot, of course, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, with the 3 officer positions. Then you had an aerial gunner crew chief who usually handled the turret on the upper turret. And you had a radio operator who fired the 2 guns out at the waist. And then you had a tail gunner who fired the 250s out of the tail. And so you had a 5-man crew on the strafer version of it. Normal armament on the B-25 coming out of the factory was it would carry around 3,000 pounds of bombs, an upper turret with 250s, had 2 side guns and 2 tail guns. This strafing version of it, which came later, was the only bomber known in our whole inventory, even today, that had 1850 calibers on it at one time, the B-25. There were several versions of it. There was one where they had a 75 millimeter cannon in it, and literally when it was fired, the airplanes stopped in midair. And it was not a very effective weaponry because the navigator became an artilleryman. He had to put the 75 millimeter shell in there, and then when it was fired, get the old shell out and reload it again before the pilot could fire it again. It was not very efficient. Although they did sink a couple of destroyers with that. The machine guns in the nose, well, you had a ring and post sight in the B-25, and you lined that up on the target. But when it came to firing those things, you can imagine the damage that 850s firing simultaneously can have. And you usually walked in there with walking your rudder pedal so you could spray as you went. And it was amazing. I mean, you cut people and things in half with those 50s. Tremendous firepower. We even had a guy that picked up an oxen with his 50s coming off a target and flew under the oxen. It was such an impact of those 850s, it took that oxen up off the mud pack on the rice paddy it was on, and he flew under it. And we were often bringing back dead chickens and crockery and all kinds of things in the engine nacelle when you hit something and then fly through it. We carried between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds of bombs in the bomb bay, depending on what kind of bombs we were flying. We did a lot of what we call parafragmentation bombs. These were bombs that we had little parachutes on, and we needed to have those to slow down the bomb as it came out. Otherwise, it would blow the rear end of the airplane off. You know, you had to get away from that. So we initiated a lot of parafragmentation bombs. We used 500 pounders on shipping. We used 250 pounders on airfields along with spraying. And in the very end of the war, we hung 5-inch high-velocity rockets, 4 of them under each wing, on top of everything else. They used to say that that B-25 Strafer had more firepower for her size than a light cruiser in the Navy. And I believe that. The B-25, even when it was brand new, was an easy airplane for pilots to fly. It was a very forgiving airplane. It didn't have any hydraulic controls, so it meant you had to have a pretty strong muscular condition in your left arm for the pilot and the right arm for the co-pilot, because you had to yank that airplane around in the air. It was tough on controls. But it was a good, solid airplane, whether you were flying instruments or as a gun platform, or the beating it would take and still come home. It was just one of our better airplanes. If you were going to correlate the B-25 Strafer to an airplane of today, you would pick the A-10, the War Dog, as they call it, because it's doing the same kind of mission, air-to-ground mission, that the B-25 did. And I've often felt that if I were still active duty today, I'd probably be in them, an A-10, as a fighter, because of the groundwork, low-level groundwork that I was used to.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Superfortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.